This is Smart Poker Study episode 183, Mental Game and 3-Bet Defense Post-Flop Strategies. In last week's Q&A, I answered multiple questions about Turbo MTTs, Harrington's M, folding strong hands, and more. Listen to that, episode 182. It's poker study time, y'all. Happy Saturday, and thank you so much for subscribing in your favorite podcaster, leaving a review, and big ups to those who tell a friend. I'm taking a little break from the NXL Europe in Chartres right now. A lot of paintball action going on. Really fun to watch. I subscribe on Go Sports, gosports.com, and it's just awesome seeing it live stream. It's like 10 or like 8 to 10 hours of just paintball action all day long. I'm loving it 3 days in a row right now. I'll get back to it right after recording this podcast. But I'm eager to get to the poker talk, so let's get to it. In today's episode, I'm going to talk about some of the mental game hiccups that lead to bad 3-bet defense decisions pre-flop, and I'll give you my strategies for overcoming these issues. Then I'll get to some post-flop strategy in 3-bet pots. I think that this leak of losing money when calling 3-bets, it's mostly a pre-flop issue of just bad 3-bet defense decisions. But we have to have some post-flop strategy discussion, and we have to have some good strategies in place to better handle these larger 3-bet pots. Please visit the show notes page for everything I discussed today, along with screenshots and links at www.smartpokerstudy.com/pod183. Let's do this! Gambate!
This is damn exciting stuff.
Mental game lapses in judgment are imperative to fix. When you know the correct strategy for positive EV plays, it really does you no good if your finger-clicking intentions, if they get hijacked by emotion or distraction on their way to your finger from your brain. So here are the most common mental game issues that cause poor 3-bet defense decisions. Number one is calling out of spite. This is when you freaking hate your opponent, you're tired of their 3-bets, and you just don't want to fold, or you don't want to 4-bet as well. The next mental game issue is over-reliance on position. So sometimes we justify making a bad call because we have post-flop position, and we think that we'll be able to use that against our opponent down the streets. A third issue, you're tired or distracted. Of course, this causes you to miss the fact that calling right now versus this 3-bet is a negative EV decision. Another issue, you're calling with hope instead of making the positive EV decision. So sometimes we set mine in a bad opportunity. Maybe we're not getting the correct pot odds or even implied odds. Or we have those pretty hands that can flop miracle hands like King 5 suited flopping a crazy flush or 6-8 flopping a crazy straight. And the final mental game issue is not wanting to adjust your open raising ranges. So you're at the kind of table where they're just 3-betting you constantly, and you know that you should shrink your range, not open as often, because you hate facing all these 3-bets. But for whatever reason, you're just sticking too rigidly to your open raising ranges. So these mental game lapses in judgment are win rate and bankroll killers. So in order to fix these issues, I want you to use this 4-step process. Step number 1 is awareness. Problems can't be solved unless you're aware of the issue. You want to take note of the mental game issues that you suffer from and prioritize them. You're going to tackle them one at a time, starting with the most frequent one. For the remainder of these steps, we're going to focus on the issue of calling with hope. Step 2 is to plan. So the mental game issue is going to pop up again. That's just a fact. You know it is because you haven't addressed it yet. Now you need to plan for how you're going to deal with it when it does happen. Are you going to avoid specific hands? Are you going to force yourself to follow your ranges? Are you going to plan a response to a 3-bet before you click that button to open raise? Or are you going to take a breath and think before every button click? So you know that you call with hope way too often. So what are the hands that you do this with? Is it all suited connectors, suited gappers, every suited ace, or even suited kings? You want to make a list right now of the hands that get you into trouble. It might be something like deuces through 6s, ace deuce suited through ace 9 suited, King 7 suited through King 10 suited, 5-4 suited up through 8-7 suited, and then the suited gappers, 6-4 suited through Queen 10 suited. When you're dealt one of these hands, before you open raise, plan what you're going to do versus a 3-bet, and then put this plan on paper. So for example, those pocket pairs, deuces through 6s, maybe your plan is to fold unless the pot odds are insanely good and there are 20x implied odds behind. For those suited ace hands, maybe your plan is to 4-bet bluff with ace 3 suited and ace 4 suited, but you're going to fold the rest. And with those suited kings, your plan could be to 4-bet bluff with king 10 suited, but then fold the rest. With the suited connectors, 5-4 suited through 8-7 suited, maybe they just getting you into way too much trouble all the time, so you're just going to fold them all. And then the suited gappers, 6-4 suited up through queen 10 suited, maybe you'll 4-bet bluff with 8-6 suited and then fold the rest. Whatever your plan is, that's totally up to you, but make it off the felt before you play your session. Speaking of playing your session, step 3 is to focus and execute. So, you want to keep your plan in front of you during your next play session. You want to focus your warm-up around the plan and commit to following your plan during the session. Then, during the session, when the inevitable happens, execute your plan. And as you're playing, try to tag hands where you implemented your plan, as well as any hands where you strayed outside of your plan. And then the final step, step 4, is assess. After your session, you want to do a quick cool down where you assess how well you played against 3-bets. Did you follow your plan? If you made any departures from your plan, were they for good reason, and do you assess those departures as positive EV decisions? In your next study session, review any tagged hands and filter for every single facing a 3-bet hand. Review them and assess the profitability of your decisions. And then, of course, adjust your plan as you see fit for your next session, then repeat the process. Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/smartpokerstudy. They have over 180,000 titles to choose from, and of course, they have both of my books, How to Study Poker Volumes 1 and 2. And if you're looking for poker content outside of my own, Audible has a lot to offer. In a prior episode, I talked about Harrington on Hold'em, that series of books. I looked for those on Audible, they didn't have them. But the next best thing, they have Jonathan Little's Secrets of Professional Tournament Poker. And it's narrated by Jonathan Little himself, so I'm probably going to pick up that series as well. So to get your free audiobook download and 30-day free trial, visit audibletrial.com/smartpokerstudy. And 2 quick shout-outs today. The Smart HUD is selling like hotcakes. Brian Spencer and Mark Cooper both purchased a Smart HUD through me. They went to smartpokerstudy.com/smarthud. As soon as they made that purchase, I sent them some videos on how to use the Smart HUD, how to practice using it, how to get more out of Poker Tracker 4. So I'm sure they're going through those videos. They're watching them. They're improving their game. I hope I don't meet these guys on the felt. And hey, you should try to stay away from them as well. So thank you very much again, Brian and Mark, for your support. Alrighty, back to class, poker people. So let's talk about post-flop in 3-bet pots. We're going to keep things simple, and we're going to approach post-flop play with one assumption in mind. You made a positive EV decision when you called the 3-bet to see the flop. So in 3-bet pots, you really need to play pretty straightforward, because mistakes now equate to greater losses. But of course, on the flip side, there's a ton of profit potential in these bigger pots. Now, straightforward doesn't necessarily mean having a fit or fold approach with no bluffing or drawing to any hands at all. What it does mean is we're looking to make only positive EV decisions, and we're ready to ditch the hand if that is the best play. In order to make positive EV decisions in 3-bet pots, there are 4 aspects that we must consider. Number 1 is your capped range and the opponent's range. Number 2, the board. Number 3, the opponent's play. And number 4, your position. We'll hit each of those in turn. So the first up was your capped range and the opponent's range. So by just calling preflop, you've told your opponent that you don't have pocket aces, pocket queens, maybe not queens, and probably not ace-king as well. Of course, those are occasionally in your 3-bet calling range, but for the most part, they're going to assume you don't have those hands. So because you're at a range disadvantage, you need to be prepared to fold a lot post-flop. But don't worry about this. It's necessary to fold a bit more, so you aren't losing more when you flop very little equity in the bigger pots. Some of your most profitable opponents, they passively call down in 3-bet pots with mediocre hands and draws. I mean, how many times have you seen a super loose passive player open, call your 3-bet preflop, and they call down all 3 streets, or I guess 2 streets, they call with a gut shot, they hit their gut shot in the river, and you wonder how they freaking had that hand the whole way. Well, theoretically, you just made a ton of value from this player who was calling in a terrible situation with terrible pot odds. Theoretical money on the flop and turn. They caught on the river, but so be it. The fact that he made these calls on the flop and turn just means that you made a ton of money off of him theoretically. You don't want to be this player. You don't want to give your profits, theoretical or otherwise, to your opponents. So you need to be prepared to fold when it's correct to do so. Your 3-betting opponent has a stronger range than you, and they oftentimes know it. They're going to use this against you to c-bet and double barrel you off of your hand. So because they have the stronger range, you need to concern yourself with what their range is. Put them on a range of 3-betting hands. Do they 3-bet pocket tens? If the answer is never, then on the 10 high board, they can't have a set right now, right? The best they can have is an overpair. And because their range is a big factor in your decisions, your own range is going to be a factor. And your opponent is going to think about what you have, not always, but quite often. If they're 3-betting, especially if they're a loose aggressive or a tight aggressive player, when they're 3-betting, they are often going to think, what can this player have? They just called, they don't have aces or kings, but what can they have? And you can take advantage of their idea of your range just based on the flop that you're presented with. And speaking of the flop, that's the second consideration, the board. So you just thought about your range and your opponent's range, and the range and board interaction is critical when deciding to continue past the flop and when you're making any value or bluff bets. So a common 3-bet range is pocket tens or greater and ace-queen. Now, this range contains 38 hands with at least one ace. On ace-high flops like ace-9-6, as the caller, you need to be very concerned. You don't have that many aces in your range. You probably have a few, but your opponent has way more aces. They have 38 aces in their range. Not counting the fact that an ace just hit the board, of course. But because that ace just hit the board, it blocks some of their combos. Now that one ace is there, they have 27 combos with at least one ace. So they hit a top pair hand or greater 53% of the time here, which is pretty scary. So it can be a good idea to fold on ace-high boards. Although, on a board of 9-8-4 rainbow, they hit it far less frequently, as the best they can have is an overpair. But you, as the preflop caller, you can potentially have pocket queens, jacks, tens, pocket nines, maybe even pocket eights, hands like jack 10 suited, and maybe even 9-8 suited. On that 9-8-4 board, geez, you just hit this big time. You have overpairs, you have sets in your range, you have open-ended straight draws as well. Now they need to take caution on this board where the best they can have is an overpair. The idea of attacking weakness and avoiding strength, it's critical for good post-flop decisions. When a board favors your opponent, be more inclined to fold, or basically avoid strength. When it favors your range, be more inclined to call, or bet, or raise. Basically, be prepared to attack them when they're not as strong. The third consideration, of course, is your opponent's play. Now, your opponent's initiative, it allows them to use continued aggression to push you off your hand with a flop c-bet, maybe a delayed c-bet, or even a double barrel bet. It's critical that you pay attention to your opponent's tendencies in 3-bet pots. You want to look at their c-bet percentages both as a total and within 3-bet pots. Most of the time these numbers are about the same, but spotting differences can lead to some good exploitative plays. It's great when their total flop c-bet is at 75%, but c-bet in 3-bet or greater pots is at 55%. This means that they are much more honest in 3-bet pots. So, you should be inclined to fold versus their display of strength. Bet sizing is another extremely important item to consider. If your opponent hit this flop and is betting for value, what sizing do you think they would use? The wetter the flop, the bigger their value bet is going to be. Conversely, if they're bluffing, what size are they going to use? The smaller the bet, the more likely it's a bluff. And small bets on really wet boards from a pre-flop 3-better are very likely cheap attempts at quote-unquote protecting their strong hand. And the last thing, you want to think ahead before you make a decision on each street. If you're calling on the flop, what can you expect from your opponent on the turn? What cards are going to be good for you, and what are good for their villain? You want to look at the stats to see how often they double barrel, how often they maybe check raise. Whatever the situation is, look at your turn and river stats to give you an idea of what to expect. And the final consideration, of course, is your position. We all know that poker's easier and more profitable when you're in position. So if you're following your 3-bet defense ranges, you're going to be in position more so than you'll be out of position post-flop, because you defend a little bit more when in position. So when you're in position, here are your flop options. The first is to fold, and this is the most common line that you're going to take. When the flop gives you 0 to little equity, and you can't see future bluffs working out too well, this is going to be the best option. The next option is to call. Now, this is a valid play when the pot odds you're being offered make it a positive EV decision to stay in with draws or some kind of made equity hand, like second pair, an under pair, bottom 2 pair, whatever it might be. The third option is to raise. Now, this is the least common play you're going to make, but it can be extremely profitable for both bluffs and value raises. You want to gauge the situation, your opponent's range and the board. Think about it carefully because you're committing many more chips due to the size of the 3-bet pot. If you're going for value, you want to know that your opponent can continue with worse. If you're bluffing, you want to know that they can fold better hands. And the last option is to bet when they check it to you. So when you're 3-betting opponent, maybe they show weakness by checking the flop. For example, you often see this when somebody has ace-king or ace-queen and the flop is like 9-7-4. Your bet in position is often going to take it down when your opponent only has 2 overcards, unless they're a bit sticky and do not like to fold on the flop. Now here are your out of position options. Number 1 is to check fold, and this is probably going to be the most common line you'll take, especially with 0 or very little equity in the hand. The next is to check call, and this is fine to do if the pot odds being offered make it worth the price to continue with your draws and with your not the strongest of hands, like top pair, weak kicker, maybe under pair kind of stuff, if your opponent is capable of bluffing. But of course, if you're check calling, be ready for your opponent to double barrel the turn. Now your third option is to check raise. And of course, being out of position, this is a great way to get value from your opponent, get more money into the pot. And it's also a great way to bluff them off because check raises do look pretty darn strong. Everybody check raises with 2 pairs and with sets. So your opponent is going to assume at least that's part of your check raising range here. Your fourth option is to donk bet. Now, this is betting out before your opponent has the chance to act. This can throw them off their game, but I really don't recommend it. If you had a value hand, you're probably check raising like we just discussed, right? So you want to balance your check raising range with value and with some bluffs thrown in. Don't do those donk bluff bets. Let your weaker opponents make those plays. And your final option is to probe the next street, or you can call it stabbing at the pot on the next street. Now, this is betting on a street after the opponent checked behind on the prior street. They showed weakness by checking behind after making that pre-flop 3-bet. So you can often assume they have some kind of underpair or ace-king, ace-queen, something that just really doesn't want to bet for value right here. So because they showed that weakness on the very next street, take a stab at it and bluff them off their hand. So whether you are in position or out of position on the flop, you have a ton of plays and different bet sizes at your disposal. Choose the one that's going to most likely yield the result that you're looking for, whether it's value or a bluff, and then pull the trigger on it. Challenge! Here's my challenge to you for this episode. Everyone has some form of mental game leak. So, what's yours? Follow the 4-step process I outlined for correcting your mental game leaks and implement it with your very next play session. First, be aware of the issue. Next, plan out how you will address it in-game. The third, focus on your plan and execute it. And then the 4th step, assess your play afterwards. Now it's your turn to take action and Scooby-Dooby-Doo something positive for your poker game.
Oh, that's it now. Get out there and be somebody. Go write a book.
This episode isn't complete until you head to the show notes page at www.smartpokerstudy.com/pod183. Go there for screenshots and links to everything discussed today, and you can discover ways in which you can support the podcast and keep me keeping on. And here's another great reason to check out the show notes. It's basically a transcript of everything I just said. So what you can do is you can copy it all, paste it into a Word document or into Evernote, delete all the extraneous stuff, save only the most important stuff, and then bam, you've taken your notes from listening to this podcast. And you can refer back to it at any time to refresh yourself on some mental game strategies and post-flop 3-bet strategies. Thank you so much for listening today. I am putting out more episodes now, so make sure you enable my Alexa flash briefing skill. And of course, subscribe to the show in iTunes or your favorite podcatching app. You can find me on Twitch, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. All you gotta do is type or say the word Smart Poker Study. And if you have any questions, I have answers. Send an email to sky@smartpokerstudy.com. Alrighty, poker peeps, in the next episode, number 184, I'm going to introduce you to a brand new league to plug, one that most of you have never even considered. Stay tuned to find out what it is. Word of mouth is the best advertising, so thank you very much for sharing the show with other poker people. Your sharing and caring is what helps us grow. Until next time, study smart, play much, and make your next session the best one yet.